make others comfortable about inviting us, about hosting us. And then it challenges us finally to now enter into those spaces as appropriate guests. Like we would want people entering into our space to be guests, right? Well, all that invites what, right? Vulnerability. All that invites a kind of way of being spirit-filled that isn't in charge, that is open to surprise, that's open to the other on the other's terms. When we enter into the space as guests, we are not there with an agenda. We're on God's agenda at that point. We're on the agenda of being guests of others, following in Trinitarian hospitality. We're going as guests of others because the Spirit goes and is our guest.
My mother felt in 11th grade that my being a psychologist might be a good idea because she saw me observing the family. My specialty in graduate school and soon after was anger management, hypertension and anger management. Different things were going on where I needed to make a shift in that. And that was the first time that I said, all right, Lord, I was already committed to be a psychologist, but I am totally open to what direction I should take in terms of my specialty. I go to Colgate Rochester Divinity School, and he's just leading me on this little pilgrimage. I can still not remember how long I went to that library on Saturdays. It was important to be in that physical space. I started reading about spirituality, and then the spirituality and health that emerged as a focus. That was now almost 25 years ago. What's fascinating now is that that is not only my research specialty, my teaching, the focus in worship, all of these things are kind of converging on a greater focus on spiritual experience and health-related dimensions. And not only in the content of what I do, but in the process. Process meaning how we do it. What are we embodying as we live this out? So if I'm talking about spirituality and health, but I'm working with my students in a way that's not fostering their spiritual growth and our collective health, God kind of convicts me about that. And he reminds me that it's not just the content I care about. I care about who you're becoming and who your students and colleagues are becoming as you're working together.
One of the images that I began to really be impacted by when I think about Pentecost and the Spirit being poured out upon all flesh. There's a sense then in which our fleshliness hosts the Holy Ghost. We know about incarnation and the Son of God going into the far country and taking on human flesh. But as Pentecostal growing up, I'm pressed now to think Pentecostally about this notion of human hospitality of the divine. We're invited to think about us being hosts of the Spirit. That means that the Spirit becomes a guest. When we think about the interreligious encounter, being good missionaries that we are, right, we want to invite the religious other into our space. And that's all important, that's all good, but that's half of this notion of hospitality. Because when we invite the other, whether it's the religious other or any other into our space, we're still establishing the framework of the space of hospitality. We're still the folks in charge. So if we're in charge, then the other will always abide on our terms. Trinitarian hospitality is less about being hosts and more about being guests. Incarnational Pentecostal hospitality is about being guests. Now that's challenging on a number of fronts. It challenges us to not be in charge. It challenges us to go. But more than that, it challenges us to go in ways that make others comfortable about inviting us, about hosting us. And then it challenges us finally to now enter into those spaces as appropriate guests. Like we would want people entering into our space to be guests, right? Well, all that invites what, right? Vulnerability. All that invites a kind of way of being spirit-filled that isn't in charge, that is open to surprise, that's open to the other on the other's terms. When we enter into the space as guests, we are not there with an agenda. We're on God's agenda at that point. We're on the agenda of being guests of others, following in Trinitarian hospitality. We're going as guests of others because the Spirit goes and is our guest.
My mother felt in 11th grade that my being a psychologist might be a good idea because she saw me observing the family. My specialty in graduate school and soon after was anger management, hypertension and anger management. Different things were going on where I needed to make a shift in that. And that was the first time that I said, all right, Lord, I was already committed to be a psychologist, but I am totally open to what direction I should take in terms of my specialty. I go to Colgate Rochester Divinity School, and he's just leading me on this little pilgrimage. I can still not remember how long I went to that library on Saturdays. It was important to be in that physical space. I started reading about spirituality, and then the spirituality and health, that emerged as a focus. That was now almost 25 years ago. What's fascinating now is that that is not only my research specialty, my teaching, the focus in worship, all of these things are kind of converging on a greater focus on spiritual experience and health-related dimensions. And not only in the content of what I did, but in the process. Process meaning how we do it. What are we embodying as we live this out? So if I'm talking about spirituality and health, but I'm working with my students in a way that's not fostering their spiritual growth and our collective health, God kind of convicts me about that. And he reminds me that it's not just the content I care about. I care about who you're becoming and who your students and colleagues are becoming as you're working together.
One of the images that I began to really be impacted by when I think about Pentecost and the Spirit being poured out upon all flesh, there's a sense then in which our fleshliness hosts the Holy Ghost. We know about incarnation and the Son of God going to the far country and taking on human flesh. But as Pentecostal growing up, I'm pressed now to think Pentecostally about this notion of human hospitality of the divine. We're invited to think about us being hosts of the Spirit. That means that the Spirit becomes a guest. When we think about the interreligious encounter, being good missionaries that we are, right, we want to invite the religious other into our space. And that's all important, that's all good, but that's half of this notion of hospitality. Because when we invite the other, whether it's the religious other or any other into our space, we're still establishing the framework of this space of hospitality. We're still the folks in charge. So if we're in charge, then the other will always abide on our terms. Trinitarian hospitality is less about being hosts and more about being guests. Incarnational Pentecostal hospitality is about being guests. Now that's challenging on a number of fronts. It challenges us to not be in charge. It challenges us to go. But more than that, it challenges us to go in ways that make others comfortable about inviting us, about hosting us. And then it challenges us finally to now enter into those spaces as appropriate guests. Like we would want people entering into our space to be guests, right? Well, all that invites what, right? Vulnerability. All that invites a kind of way of being spirit-filled that isn't in charge, that is open to surprise, that's open to the other on the other's terms. When we enter into the space as guests, we are not there with an agenda. We're on God's agenda at that point. We're on the agenda of being guests of others, following in Trinitarian hospitality. We're going as guests of others because the Spirit goes and is our guest.
My mother felt in 11th grade that my being a psychologist might be a good idea because she saw me observing the family. My specialty in graduate school and soon after was anger management, hypertension and anger management. Different things were going on where I needed to make a shift in that. And that was the first time that I said, all right, Lord, I was already committed to be a psychologist, but I am totally open to what direction I should take in terms of my specialty. I go to Colgate Rochester Divinity School, and he's just leading me on this little pilgrimage. I can still not remember how long I went to that library on Saturdays. It was important to be in that physical space. I started reading about spirituality, and then the spirituality and health that emerged as a focus. That was now almost 25 years ago. What's fascinating now is that that is not only my research specialty, my teaching, the focus in worship, all of these things are kind of converging on a greater focus on spiritual experience and health-related dimensions. And not only in the content of what I do, but in the process. Process meaning how we do it. What are we embodying as we live this out? So if I'm talking about spirituality and health, but I'm working with my students in a way that's not fostering their spiritual growth and our collective health, God kind of convicts me about that. And he reminds me that it's not just the content I care about. I care about who you're becoming and who your students and colleagues are becoming as you're working together.
Leaders are people who have followers, and people follow you because of your character, first and foremost, the way you conduct yourself and the way you treat them.
It's dying to self and saying, you love me more than I love my employees, more than I do. You see the future and I can't, and you know best, I just think I do.
There's no substitute for good leadership. It isn't that we just need one good leader. We need 100 good leaders.
When you are given the gift of leadership in a business, that means you also have some pretty high responsibilities in how you set up the culture of your business. And part of that culture is how you come alongside your employees.
As an investor in these companies that are advancing human society, I think God loves it. I'm like a little child looking for what can I do today? Where can I invest to please our God?
Well, good morning. Welcome to Fuller Seminary. My name is Max Waddell, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Admissions for Academic Programs here at Fuller. Welcome to our Experience Fuller event. As the name suggests, this is intended the entire day for you to experience Fuller, what it might be like to be a student here, what it might be like to be a part of our community. So thank you for joining us here, and thank you for joining us online on our live stream today as well. As a part of that experience and a part of the day, we'll start this morning with what we call Fuller Classroom, and it gives you a chance to hear from a professor from each of our 3 schools and kind of get those voices, those perspectives on a common theme. Today's theme is work, and it follows the theme from our most recent Fuller magazine, which if you didn't grab, are welcome to do so at some point today. We have those available for you. But if you're like me, you'll cherish these opportunities to hear from our just wonderful professors and leaders here on campus. I did my MDiv here, so I was a student in the School of Theology, and after graduating and being able to interact with more of our faculty and more of our leaders, whether from theology, psychology, or intercultural studies, I started to regret slightly that I didn't take more classes in other schools or in other fields. So Fuller's passionate about doing that. We're passionate about integration. So if that interests you, we can talk about that as the day goes on. But thank you for being here. If you have questions throughout the day, please find either myself or one of our staff members, admissions counselors. We're here to help you. We're here to answer questions. So please feel free to do so as we go through the day. But that's enough hearing from me. Before I invite our professors up, would you join me in a word of prayer? Let's pray as we start this morning. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for these people. We thank you for the opportunity to learn from one another. God, may you open our hearts and our minds and our ears so that we may receive whatever it is you have for us today. Be with us today and every day. Amen. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Mark Roberts. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning. I'm glad to be with you, and I'm glad you're here. I first began to experience Fuller Seminary 40 years ago as a college student. In the summer, I came over, I audited a class. And if we had more time, I would explain how that was transformational to my life. So 40 years later, I'm still delighted to be a part of this community and glad you are here. I'm also glad to be able to talk about work, because work is central to my own work here with the Max De Pree Center for Leadership. We strive to help people live out their faith in the context of their daily, you might even say, ordinary work. And that's what I want to talk with you about this morning. My thesis is simple, and it's this. Through work, which is an essential element of human flourishing, we can make a difference that matters to ourselves, to our neighbors, to our world, and to our God. So again, through work, which is an essential element of human flourishing, we can make a difference that matters to ourselves, our neighbors, our world, and our God. Now, I did not always believe this about work. I grew up thinking about work in terms of sustenance. The value of work was that it made money to sustain life. My dad, for example, had to work because our family needed to eat and be clothed, to sleep indoors. When my dad lost his job when I was a child and was unemployed for 3 years, my greatest worry was that we wouldn't have food or clothing or home. As I grew up in church, I began to realize that some kind of work actually has value beyond simply making money to sustain life. I learned that work was a way that we could glorify God and promote God's own work in the world. But not all work fit into that category. You see, the work that really counted in my growing up was the work done by pastors, missionaries, maybe doctors, teachers, professors might count. Now, nobody in my church ever said this explicitly, but I intuited it from the things we celebrated and the ways we prayed. We were always thrilled whenever someone had a call to the ministry, by which we meant pastoral ministry, or someone was led by God to the mission field. We were not as excited if someone decided to be a lawyer or a cabinet maker or a full-time parent. We would take time in worship to pray for seminarians, to pray for missionaries, but not for ordinary workers. The work that made a difference was done by special people with a special calling. Now, fast forward 25 years. I finished my doctoral work in New Testament. I'm pastoring a church in Irvine, California, down in Orange County, and I'm learning an awful lot about work. When I visit my church members in their workplaces, I discover that many of them think of their secular work as a calling from God. A teacher I visit believes she is serving God as she helps kindergarten students begin to feel comfortable and at home at school. The CEO of a giant automotive company shares with me how he prays every day for his workers, his customers, his vendors, and so much more. He believes he's serving God in leading this giant company. And so I begin to search the scriptures to see what is there about work that I have missed. And I discover passage after passage after passage that affirms the value of work, not just the particular work of pastors or missionaries, but the work that we might call secular work or ordinary work. The Theology of Work Project has focused on this particular issue of Scripture and work, and in its commentary that's available online for free, or you can purchase it, they look at over 850 passages of Scripture that are relevant to the conversation about work. I can point to just a couple examples. Work appears in the first chapter of the Bible, and there we see God as the worker. God creates. God delights in what God has created. Work is not incidental to God, but central to God's own nature and activity. And then after creating the universe and the earth and creating all the animals, God creates human beings in God's own image. Genesis 1:27 says God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Well, if we are made in God's image, then surely we are to be people who work, and that hunch is confirmed in the very next verse. The very first command God gives to humankind is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. It's interesting, isn't it, that the first command is not build an altar and sacrifice to me. It's not praise me in song, but really, it's get to work. Get to work in the business of not only making babies, but making culture. So God made the world very good, but incomplete, and gave to us the opportunity through our work to fill his world. The centrality of work is confirmed in the second chapter of Genesis, where God creates the man to till and keep the garden. By tilling the garden, it will help it to be productive. By keeping it, it is protecting the garden from exploitation. And then God creates a woman as man's partner in the business of tilling and keeping. Notice, and this is important, that work is not a result of sin. It's not punishment. We will sometimes hear that. Now, clearly, once sin enters the picture, work gets messed up and it gets harder. And we work by the sweat of our brow, and there are thorns and thistles and pain in childbearing. But work is before sin. Work is a part of God's gift to us, God's calling to us. The second passage I want to mention this morning is in Mark 6. It comes in the context when Jesus was at his hometown and he is preaching to people at his hometown, and they're perplexed. And they ask this question, isn't this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters with us? Is this not the carpenter? In Greek, that's the word tekton. It's related actually to our word technology. It was used in the time of Jesus for craftspeople, not only those who worked with wood, but also those who worked with stone or metal. Jesus was a builder. Now, the idea of Jesus as a carpenter or builder is not a new idea. But if you think about the fact that God became incarnate in Christ, the very Word of God incarnate in Jesus, spent 30-ish years on earth, most of that time as an adult doing ordinary work, working with his hands, serving people, making a difference that way. And God appears not to have considered that to be a colossal waste of the time of the incarnate Word. It's common to hear that Jesus began his ministry at age 30 and it lasted for 3 years. I would suggest that Jesus began his ministry at around age 12. His first ministry was that of serving people as a builder. And then at around age 30, he had a career change and entered the messianic season of his ministry. So in Jesus, we see, I think, that through work, which is an essential element of human flourishing, we can make a difference that matters to ourselves, our neighbors, our world, and our God. I want to close with a story, an experience I've had recently of someone who, through her work, made a difference in my own life. Last few years, I was writing a commentary on Ephesians, and it was a difficult time for me. It was not an easy task at all. And I spent a good bit of time actually back at Harvard in the libraries there, studying and just really not having an easy time. But I would go each morning over to Harvard Law School to their dining commons to get some coffee. And the woman who served coffee in the little booth there, a woman named Doraline, African-American woman, even older than I am. Turns out she was once retired but needed something else to do with her life, went back to work. And Doraline treated me every morning with kindness. She would always ask me, "What can I get for you this morning, dear?" And I needed somebody to call me dear. She and I would exchange pleasantries, but I never bothered to tell her how much she was meaning to my life. Last month, I was speaking at a conference in New York and met a student at Harvard Law School. And she was talking about how difficult her experience there was and how tense it was. And I said, boy, I get that. I said, when I used to hang around, there was only one ray of light in that whole place. And it was this woman, Doraline, who served coffee. She said, yes, Doraline made such a difference. And so there we are in New York talking about this woman who works there. So I was actually going up the next weekend to the Boston area, and I thought, I'm going to go see if I can find Doraline, tell her this. And the first day I went over there to the cafe, she wasn't there. I was disappointed. I thought, oh, maybe she's retired again or something. And the next day I came and she was there. So I waited until there was nobody else waiting in line. So I went up and she said, of course, so what can I get for you today, dear? I said, I'll get some coffee in a minute, but if it's okay, I'd like to tell you a story. So I told her what happened and how I was down in New York, and this law student and I had this conversation about her and how much her way of serving us in this place has made a difference in her life. When I told her that, she stepped back almost like she had been struck and got big tears in her eyes. And she said, "Oh, thank you for telling me that story." Meanwhile, the guy standing next to me is agreeing. He starts talking to me. "Yes, she really does make a difference around here." And so finally she said, "Well, I said, I'd like a latte." She's over at the coffee machine. She's making the latte, and I can hear her talking to herself. And she is saying, "Yes, I really do make a difference. I really do make a difference." And so, friends, whether it's in serving coffee with kindness, pastoring a church, being a missionary, teaching classes, being a doctor, serving in the public sector, organizing rallies for justice, whatever it is, God works in and through us in our work, and we can make a difference that matters for ourselves and for our neighbors, for our world, and for God. Thank you.
My name is Johnny, and I am from the School of Intercultural Studies. And it's a pleasure to be with you online or in person. Now, following the theme of work, coming to seminary is hard work. Regardless of which career you will be following, you will be pursuing, the fact that you will spend energy thinking about thinking will create a lot of anguish. And I am here to tell you that this anguish is related to our relationship with ourselves, but it's also related with our relationship with Jesus. Yes, indeed, it is all about Jesus, but how do we define who Jesus is? How do we define our relationship with Him and with His church? You will be shaken. You will be shaken not because professors are evil people thinking early in the morning, today I will disrupt my students. As much as we may look like we are doing that, that's not the case. It is because we ourselves are frail. And we know it's all about Jesus. But we first began, just like you, thinking that it was just about Jesus and putting the puzzle together. And we began our careers having a full puzzle. It was finished. All the pieces were there, or perhaps just one piece was missing, and we came to the seminary to find that one piece. In reality, welcome to the 21st century, and in fact, welcome to the first century. It was like that from the very beginning, because which puzzle were you filling out the pieces into a complete figure? Was it the puzzle of Matthew? Or was it the puzzle of Mark? Or was it the puzzle of John? Or dare I say, was it the puzzle of Paul? Because he comes up with his own gospel. And he in fact tells you that even if an angel comes to you and tells you a gospel different than his puzzle pieces, reject it. And at seminary, we are to introduce you to two possibilities, and it's up to you. One possibility is seeing the puzzle with all, imagining it with all the pieces there. Nothing missing, all the corners there. Those that do puzzles tell me that they begin by the corners, and then the margins, and then they may classify them by color or by shades or... Well, I don't really do puzzles, you see. I am dyslexic, so that will be a very difficult thing for me. But I deal with puzzles of a different kind, puzzle of ideas. Now, this puzzle has missing pieces, no corners. It is still Jesus. You have to decide if you need to hang on to the full puzzle that you came here to seminary with, and with the certainty of this puzzle, and not welcome any possibility to discover different pieces, different puzzles of the same man, Jesus. Jesus was a very different person for the Syrophoenician woman north in the southern tip of Lebanon, what is Lebanon today, when he told her that he came to the children of Israel and he cannot waste the gospel in dogs. These were the words of Jesus to the Syrophoenician woman. You're a dog, I cannot waste the gospel in you. Well, her experience of Jesus is very different from the experience of the one who receives eyesight when Jesus called on him to heal him, and so many others. There's no one Jesus, just like there's no one Johnny. If you ask my son Johnny, who Johnny is, the father, he will be telling you a story. He could tell you the story of the day when I walked into the house and I overheard him speak an evil word, a bad word, una palabra mala. And I went after him and grabbed him by the hand and said, Johnny, we have talked about this before. You cannot be using bad words. I will have to wash your mouth with soap. So I grabbed him by the hand and he started crying. We got to the sink and I took a little bit of soap, stick your tongue out, and I put the soap and I had him do gurgles and wash his mouth. And then I went back as a proud parent, such a good parent I am. I have everything under control. I know that Jesus I know, and everything is in place. And then the older brother was adamant to speak up, but being the older brother, very diligently obeying his dad. Papi, what did you think he said? And I said, no, we don't have to repeat. Well, what he said was this, and it was another word, and it rhymes with the word you thought you heard. At that moment, I said to my son, I made a mistake. Now it's your turn to wash my tongue with soap. So let's go to the bathroom. And he cleaned his eyes, and he wiped, and he started then kind of giggling and then laughing, and grabbed my hand. In front of the sink, he started to build up a crust of soap. Then suddenly, he put the soap down and said, no, let's go to the room. He washed his hands, he took me by the hand, and he took me to the room, and he said, I want you to lay down, and I am not giving an example. I am not saying I am good. I am not saying the things I did in the past for parenting skills are the example to follow. None of those that I'm saying. He said, I will have to spank you because this is worse than you. This is really bad what you did. And Daddy, you need to know, Papi, you have to know, it will hurt me more than you. So lower your pants and lay on the bed. And he proceeded to give me 3 spankings with the belt. I thought I had all the pieces. And I had a choice to stick to the guns or to submit and humbly as a proud man like I am could handle, walk into darkness, walk into the unknown. Jesus is more than one thing because there's more than one individual in this world, and he abides in all of us. These are 2 different models of the network way that we need to conceive the world. You see, in the 20th century and in most churches, denominational or congregational, they still think like we used to think in the 20th century in lineal fashion. So the question is not, what am I to do and what works? The question is, what is truth? The question of what is truth is a lineal question that produces puzzles with all the pieces. The question of what am I to do and what works is a relationship question, and it's a network. The 21st century, just like the first century, emphasizes networks. In this process of networking, you discover that the answers are never the same. Learning to navigate the continuum between the descriptions of God, creation, and the teachings God left and is still unfolding via the Holy Spirit, the Bible, current and ancient Christian literature, as well as personal illuminated truth that God chooses to give you like gold nuggets. That's what the seminary work is. So if you thought you came to gain the pieces for the puzzle that has all the pieces, to put it together, and this is eternal truth forever and ever, the only truth that is eternal forever and ever is a person, and his name is Jesus. It is all about Jesus. When it comes to us and humanity, it is all about relationships. And these relationships are about networking, not about linear propositional truth. This non-linear truth is about relationships. If you want to understand what that means, then figure it out. Women were not supposed to enter the tabernacle or be priests, and still a prostitute woman anointed Jesus, preparing him for his death. How can this be? How can it be that a woman pour alabaster oil and perfume on Jesus' head to anoint him, and he says, everywhere the gospel is preached, you will talk about this woman, and he says, this woman prepared me for my death, and he says, this woman has done the will of God. That makes no sense. No propositional linear truth can prepare a model to put those two together. But the Jesus of relationships that you will be learning at in your psychology classes, in your systematic theology classes, in your New Testament, Old Testament, as well as many courses in the School of Intercultural Studies. For example, Christian anthropology from the margins that I will be teaching in the fall. Now, we need to end. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the results of work, so that no one may boast. For we are what he has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. I love these networking approaches of the postmodern world and of the global interconnection world of the first century, all the way to the 21st. Did you see the contradiction? No, it's not about works. Works have nothing to do. It's all about faith. Oh, by the way, you will be doing plenty of works that I have prepared for you. So it's not about works, but it's all about works because of the relationship with Jesus. Praise to his name. Thank you for your careful attention.
And I am a professor teaching in School of Psychology. And similar to what Mark said, actually, I experienced Fuller 30 years ago. And it's been a great honor for me to come back to teach Fuller and great sense of calling. The topic of work actually appears in part of my research with vocational identity development, but also, of course, in the clinical work of many of the clients. But today, what I would like to do is share with you briefly the course I teach in cultural and spiritual narrative and psychotherapy. This is actually a course that was designed to be much more experiential for our graduate students so that they could analyze more deeply their personal narrative and understand how the culture and spirituality are interwoven in their own calling, training in psychology, and so how we can also facilitate that in our clients and exploring their narrative. But of course, in the interest of our time today, it is very difficult to do that. So what I'm going to try to do is focus briefly in terms of why narrative is a particularly helpful approach when we're working with clients from diverse contexts. So, with the globalization, one of the biggest impact is that the primary psychological influence we know is related to identity. And most people we know today are dealing with bicultural or hybrid identity. I used to think that this was something only of an issue of immigrants or, first or second generation. And as I travel and teach different parts of the world, I realize this is now everywhere. And so most individuals are partly rooted in their local culture and as well as the other parts stemming from their awareness of their relationship to the global culture. And you can see that in these, very visual. Sorry, went to the wrong direction. So identity is now something that we have to create and recreate in much more active basis than ever before. And they're based less on prescribed social roles and more on individual choices. Now that seems like, something that we just take it for granted now. But actually, in terms of our clinical work, this is a daunting task, especially if individuals coming from two systems of thought and values, and they're faced with having to make sense of what all these values mean and how to make decisions, especially when it comes to the what path they need to pursue in relationship, love, and work. This is a primary focus of many of the adults we see clinically. So with growing diversity and globalization, psychologists must acquire skills to help in understanding, reading, and interpreting behavior within the cultural context. Now, the emphasis here is within. This is something we have to work inside out, not outside in, so that we can't just simply impose our personal views and values on various clients, but we need tools in terms of how to explore deeply where each individual is coming from. And for me, the narrative is a useful ways in which we can explore deeply the particular culture and religious tradition clients come to us. Now, narrative psychology has roots in the philosophical traditions such as continental philosophy, existential, and philosophical, and it integrates theoretical areas such as the Gestalt, perception theories, personal construct, cognitive development, and the most recent work in the cognitive science. And so this has been a very valuable in terms of integrating all different areas of social science. Now have the narrative turn impacting. And so, it would not be possible for me today to cover all the important areas of contribution, but what I would highlight is maybe a few key concepts in terms of what is pertinent to us in clinical psychology, and give you at the end a brief example of how we may be able to deepen our understanding working with individuals related to their relationship to work. Jerome Bruner was a cognitive psychologist at Harvard, had argued that human beings have two modes of thought. One is the rational, or what we call a paradigmatic mode of thinking. And this privileges logical, analytical, and mathematical language modality. And this is probably our old view, what we call computational model of thinking. So it's input, output, information processing. Today, the narrative mode of thinking privileges emotion, intuition, imagination, and creativity. And this is what we now call the new emotional theory of mind, or embodied cognition. And basically, in a nutshell, I would say that this focus on how thinking is deeply integrated with emotion and our even feelings and body. So these are our brain, body, environment, system that all impacting our thinking. What is important for us to know is that we are basically narrative being before we even learn language. That means, for most children, they learn language at 2 to 3. Before they, can fluent speaker, they are already learning concept about self, other, and the world. And all of that involves what we call the narrative embodied emotional learning. And so, we can say that all reason-based communication is narrative. And this continues not only from infancy, but throughout our adult life. So narrative, we now know, are emergent, pre-linguistic, and embodied. And because emotions are relational and storied, what it means is that narrative serves as a coherent background and upon which the emotion emerges. And this is something that we should particularly pay attention in psychotherapy. Because much of what we're doing, especially the narrative, becomes a theoretical window to examine self-development across the life course. And the reason for that is that language plays a particularly critical role in constructing the formation and the structuring of the self and identity. And now here at Fuller, we spend a lot of time talking about spiritual formation. And my area of particular focus is how that is also impacted by culture. I think what is important for us to realize that in order for us to understand ourselves and others, we need to explore the meaning system much more deeply. How did this meaning system emerge? And this structure, what is interesting is that it has at least 2 levels. And the surface level of meaning, this is what most of us are aware. This is the explicit, conscious level. But unfortunately, now the experts let us know that this is maybe 2 to, at max, 10% of our awareness. So at the deeper level, at least 98 to 90% of our understanding or meaning are shaped and are out of our awareness, very implicit. So, I also teach our clinical students how to listen deeply, and I tell them often that they will be worth every penny they earn because they'll be working with this 98% of the unknown, and that is unknown to even the clients themselves. And it's a total journey into how to enter into these deeper areas of meaning. And when we take this and apply it to culture, the complexity is exponential. Because, if much of what we know about culture or religion at the surface level, is only at the tip of the iceberg. What is of interest to us, especially, is at the deeper level, how our core value has been shaped and formed. And when we unpack these core values, what we find is this is where our drive, our motivation, what drive us to certain callings or vocational, right, aspirations, it's hidden often from our conscious awareness. So just to illustrate briefly in the remaining time, I would just say, because all our this deeper meaning system is impacted by culture, religion, history, even pop culture, we have to explore in a multifaceted way. And if you look at, I don't know if you know of any grandparents or great-grandparents who experienced Depression era, you know that they were deeply impacted by this historical event. And if you have ever heard expressions like, boy, you can't waste anything, you have to save every penny, penny pinchers. These are all mottos about what motivates one and how to live, right, in life. Well, if you also know of grandparents or work with veterans who survived serving in World War II, you know that they were also deeply impacted by the trauma of war, and that has altered their understanding of life purpose and meaning. They're strongly formed by the call of duty, honor, and patriotism, and the strong work ethic and self-reliance is something that was passed down to multiple generations. So by the time it reaches you, you may not quite know why we have such a drive toward independence, hard work, and performance. But these are something that lies at deeper core as I work with students. So I would say that these are the big stories in which all of us live inside them, and they shape who we are, where we came from, and where we are going. And, all of us, one way or another, here in America is shaped by the American dream. And, some of our students, as they unpack their own background, often coming from even Midwest or Bible Belt, they realize how their, religious and, mini subculture have shaped their ideas of what is good life, what they're pursuing in relationship as well as their calling. My area of both research as well as clinical work, I often, work with bicultural individuals, and what I often see is this split between the new and the old. If I would just briefly say that, because in the interest of time, the old often represent the traditional world where it's about the we consciousness, whereas in the new, modern, associated with I consciousness, individual choice. Now, if it was simply as one or the other, that would be easier, but most individuals that I work with, they appear on the surface very westernized and Americanized, and they would explicitly state they're very independent, fiercely independent, in fact. But as we explore and work more deeply about their struggles, their values actually lie deeply held from their earliest upbringing. So I have stories of mid-level manager who explicitly would say, I'm very independent, and yet his managerial style with subordinates were much more about like taking care of younger siblings. And then with their superior, showing respect and earning respect was so important, like it was with their parents. So these things are deeply hidden, but they, help us form why we do what we do. And it's also true of many of the second generation, highly successful women I have interviewed. On the surface, they would say they are very driven by the independence and, individualism in terms of their success. But when we unpack their stories, what we discover is that what drove them, what motivated them was actually the collective survival and security of the family. So that was a very interesting thing for us to see. So this is what we see in popular media, the ad of Angeli perfume. It reads, the 8-hour fragrance for the 24-hour woman. That was in the 70s and 80s. The Saimdang is a new remake of the Korean drama, which really captured the famous Korean woman artist and calligrapher who lived in the early 16th century. And why this is interesting is in the Neo-Confucianism, women, even in the upper class, were not taught to read or write. But the juxtaposition of these two images show that it's a struggle, actually, of both, the old and the new, the traditional values as well as the modern value, as women are caught in between these two public images and discourses about family and work. So what is considered to be virtuous, ideal woman then and now? The form may be different different, but the meaning may have not changed, and women continue to struggle to make sense between the traditional images of women valuing family over self, but at the same time also telling modern educated women that she can achieve, do it, and have it all. You know, she can have the beauty, strength, power, and relationships. But they also raise important questions for us. What is the meaning of work? Is it just for the purpose of self-fulfillment or fulfilling family obligation? And this is often where I see individual clients cut between the two worlds and trying to make sense. So I would say that the topic of self is explored frequently in the privacy and the sacred space of a therapy hour. However, the self is also a public discourse. Its betterment is not just a personal matter, but it merits care and deeper critical reflection, particularly those charged with maintaining a proper moral order: the church, the school, the family, the community, and of course, psychology.
Well, that was great. Thank you to each of you and the different perspectives that you bring to this topic. Now we actually have a few minutes where we'll actually be able to engage, ask some questions. And to those of you who are live streaming, joining us online, you can text questions to 626-344-8205. And I suppose if you're here too and you'd rather text, you can use that as well. But if you are here, there's also microphones in either stair next to the rows. But yeah, so this is a time either to respond to something that our professors have shared, or to ask a question about their particular school or discipline, or to ask a more general question about Fuller. But do we have any questions here that we want to start with?
Could I give a testimony while they are preparing?
Please.
I arrived at Fuller in 1981, and it was only for 3 months, for a quarter, on a furlough from our Central American missionary work in Costa Rica. And the learning experience that took place in the classroom was fantastic. To be with the professors who wrote the New Testament Encyclopedia and the Theology Encyclopedia, it was superb. But you know who were the first teachers of mine? The ones that did the most significant change? The females seated with hot pants around me. Coming from Latin America and a very hierarchical and male-dominated society, I was wondering what these women were doing here. And on top of that, how dare they wear hot pants with all of us holy men seated around them? But when this woman opened their mouth and they started asking questions that I could not dream of, and making comments and answering the questions of the professors, I said, give me a minute, wait a minute, what is wrong here? Johnny, about face, they are your teachers. So be prepared, fasten your seatbelts. Welcome to Fuller.
Especially if you're in one of Johnny's classes. Yeah. Do we have any? Yes. Are you able to make it out here? Otherwise, we can.
Online, they will not be able to hear you.
Sorry.
We have was it 150 people online?
Yeah. So we had about 150 people registered online. Right up here. There you go.
Well, my question is for the professor in the School of Psychology. I found it very intriguing that she stated that majority of the time we deal with the unknown. There's the surface level and then there's the unknown. And I find myself really dealing with the unknown a lot, especially with other people. How do you find that balance where individuals surface level. However, I find myself responding to the unknown. And because I respond to the unknown, I am misunderstood. Because there's that surface level in their understanding. So how do you find that balance with bringing it back to the surface level to be understood?
Well, that's an excellent question. Well, welcome to my world. Yes, but actually that is fascinating because, I've heard neuroscientists describe that, with all the stars in the galaxy, there are more neurons in our brain. The inner space is so infinite, so fascinating, and always mysterious. I think the challenge is how we begin from at the surface level, and this is not just rational knowing, as I described, but especially relational. So, what I teach in the first year, or training our clinical students, is it's not about getting ahead of our client, but how to sit with them. And even if we may see things ahead, we have to know how to connect deeply with the client and slowly descend. And then the material will start to surface. But it's really about how to listen deeply, especially at the emotional level. Because most of us have been trained how to repress all of that and focus only on the rational. Because, I think almost part of becoming adult, especially in the higher education, has been all about rationality. And, in the psychotherapy, we're always working on the other end and then connecting the two. So much of what psychotherapy, I say, is really integration of the implicit with the explicit. And, I would invite you to our clinical psychology program because we have the exciting, I would say, journey of how to, work with clients in that manner. And that's, I would say, the beauty of what the clinical work can offer, how to, unfold as the session progresses.
Thank you.
Maybe I can prime the pump here a little bit. Obviously we've heard from sort of three different perspectives in a manner of speaking. Would you each maybe briefly talk about what the integration experience has been as an instructor, as from that end, working with colleagues from different fields, yet with this unifying purpose in this singular school? Maybe brief comments about that.
I'll say something just because it struck me, both with your question and your answer, that both of you were talking a lot about relational dynamics, relational knowing, relational networks. And I'm not going to answer this question, but that seems like an essential part of the integrative process. So maybe you could talk about that overlap, because it just struck me that both of you were really, taking from the same well there.
And the overlap includes the supremacy of emotions. In fact, at a lab not far away from here at USC, they are doing experimental work on patients who have lost different portions of the brain, particularly the ones dealing with emotions and the limbic system. And it will be to say the conclusions of the lab would be to say or to imply that it is possible to have understanding, but it's not possible to have reasoning without emotions. So reasoning is subject managed by emotions instead of the other way around. You have people who, after suffering this loss from a stroke, they are able to reason out that it's not appropriate to give money away, particularly if you need to pay bills. When you talk with them, they are able to explain it, but still, they will be easily cheated, and they will give the money with a smile because the emotions are lacking and the reasoning cannot follow.
But what I would add to that is that, my area of focus is in narrative and cultural psychology, and I care very deeply about the topic of culture. But traditional, in our academia, where it was treated as rational approach, it was always something that sit outside the person. And we haven't done a deeper integration into the individual's life at the very core. And if we think about how culture and religion, all of this is learned at the labs of our primary significant figures, the earliest attachment. I think this is a challenge in terms of impacting these meaning apart from just our, I would say, learning, what we call the difference between God concept and God image. So God concept is something that we can learn from Bible studies, from Sunday school onward. So these are words we have, but then the God image is much more emotional and is deeply connected to memories. And so we may have contradictory understanding. So we can understand on a rational level God concept that he's unconditional love. But at the emotional level, we still hold on to the idea that I have to work for my salvation. And it's that kind of contradiction that, because it is so implicit and unknown, it takes quite a journey to even connect those things. I would say for me at Fuller, the opportunity to integrate all three areas, both psychology, theology, and culture, is what brings me back to Fuller. After having 30 years of journey, since the tools I've given here at Fuller to, weaving in various ways to bring this all together. Why this is particularly important, I think, as I alluded a little bit at the end of my talk, even though psychotherapy seems like an individual venture and journey, we're dealing with topics that are public concern. Psychology now is such a hot trend, even in Asia. It's interesting that as Asian countries are wrestling with a lot of the exposure to the global and Western conceptualization and the self, there's a whole kind of almost like a flooding that's going on. And I've often, as I visit here, what we need to do is maybe simply liberate the woman who's been oppressed for so many years.
Amen.
I believe Jesus is, a true liberator. But does that mean at the expense of abandoning all our responsibility to family? And so this becomes a really important public discourse. How we responsibly help individuals be fully, achieve what God had intended each individual to be. But at the same time, how do we do this well mutually? And so this is a challenge. So even in psychology, I would say the integration of theology and anthropology, all of this is a critical matter.
Thank you. We're actually starting to get a few more questions now. So two of them are very similar. So I wonder if we could get maybe one response for the sake of time. So I'll read one of them. It says, these days, many of us are inclined to separate ourselves from certain factions of Christians, preferring even to start calling ourselves followers of Jesus rather than Christian or evangelical, because of the hypocrisies and stances those terms have been conflated with in recent times. How would you describe the political climate at Fuller? And to tie that in with another question, someone pointed out that it's been said many times that Fuller is neither necessarily conservative nor liberal, but somewhere a combination of the both of those. Do any of you want to respond to that as concisely as possible? It's a big question.
Well, instead of giving opinions, I will share facts. At noontime, for the last month and a half, a group of Fuller members, both faculty, staff, and students, have been getting together to pray for the dreamers and asking God for resolution for them. That's fact number one. Fact number two, faculty members, including Juan Martinez and others, have marched along with community members in downtown LA supporting rights for so-called illegal immigrants. Fact number 3, in the School of Intercultural Studies, last quarter, we did a whole series on race, theology, and mission, where we had topics such as dismantling whiteness, defining whiteness as the oppressive mode that pretends to suppress others as unequal. I think 3 is a good set of examples. Or was it 4?
I would like to just add that I know that things sometimes being in the middle, it is not a difficult position. Just knowing the globalization and what we are bombarded with, the multiplicity. One of the impact of all of that phenomenologically is that people have withdrawn into these isolated pockets, just because it is just so difficult and challenging to think through the complexity and multiplicity. So I think that is a danger, and this is not just exclusively at Fuller, but this is a phenomenon around the world. I think the work that is cut out for us is how we work integratively. For me, integration is another word for maturity. And so how we work with differences, how we think more divergently and creatively and weave together, I really think this is what God had intended to be. Just like we have to integrate the left and the right brain in the therapy session, we have to integrate across all of these multiplicity that only enlighten us in terms of showing us where the blind spots are. How we know where we end, the other begin is through that contact. So I think it is an opportunity rather than, I think, a danger. I would say the other thing, apart from that complexity, is that what Fuller emphasized and what I valued more than 30 years ago is not just giving us the answer, but how to think critically.
Amen.
And that is a difference of not just giving you the fish, but how to fish. And that's, for me, is the most important tool that we can equip our students, especially in this very challenging times, dealing with such complex issues.
Thank you. And I see someone saying there, can I cap you off like a very short question? I don't want to.
Yeah.
I don't want to be.
It's gonna be very short.
Okay.
Yeah.
And these guys are the ones I'm really worried about.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay.
So, really, thank you so much for sharing all this stuff. It's been amazing. Really quick question: why did you choose teaching positions at Fuller?
As quick as possible. One sentence, too.
Integration.
There you go.
Calling.
I was going to say vocation, but it's the same answer. The articulation that Fuller has to understand that all of God's people have a calling, and our job is to help folk who are at Fuller discern their calling, but for many who will go out into the world as therapists or as pastors, it is their job to do the same for those they serve. And so it really was, it was the sense that this is central to the work of the seminary.
Amen.
Thank you. And we'll leave it at that. Can you join me in thanking our professors once again? So next on our schedules is lunch, and we'll have a few of our staff direct you how to get over to there. Those of you following online, if you want to join us again at 12:45, we'll be picking up our live feed again. Feel free to get something to eat yourselves, and you can check out fullerstudio.fuller.edu for some resources as well. Also, if any of you in here have not had a chance to register yet and snuck in, welcome. But also, if you could stop by the registration on the way out to make sure we have you down. Thanks very much.